Our topic tonight, how a non-canonical gospel shaped Christmas, or at least some of our traditions understanding the Christmas story. As we're probably aware, the Christmas story, we tell it in kind of one traditional way altogether, but the primary sources from it are actually two distinct versions, one found in the Gospel of Matthew, one found in the Gospel of Luke. The stories are actually contradictory from one another and written independently of each other, but we tend to then merge them all together as if it's just one story. But there's another text, another gospel, that provided a bunch of other details that didn't make it into the New Testament, and we'll talk about that tonight. So this time of year, nativity scenes are a very common sight. They come in a lot of different varieties, and there's a whole playset. They're fun, I think, also, I remember from when I was a kid, because in addition to having all of these little figures and a baby, people love babies, there's also all kinds of animals, and so lots of fun. The nativity scenes or sets are also called a crèche, and that is from the French word for manger because of the location where the baby is kept. A manger, which is kind of an old-fashioned word for feeding trough, an animal feeding trough. Sometimes these have a minimal number of characters, so you, generally speaking, need Mary and Joseph and, of course, the baby Jesus. And usually they're in a set like this, and the manger. And that doesn't have all the other figures, but most have a more substantial cast of characters, and we certainly had a complete set, not looking like this, but of the same kind of characters at home on our fireplace mantle when I was growing up, including all of the animals. So in this, we can identify the baby Jesus in a manger, his mother Mary, Joseph, her husband, then the cow, which is usually present because the cow is also interested in eating out of that manger, which is where he normally gets his food or her food. There's also a donkey. Presumably this is the donkey that Mary is riding as she and Joseph made their way to Bethlehem. There's also a shepherd or two who has shown up. The shepherds usually bring their sheep with them, at least one freestanding sheep. They're often holding one. There's the angel who told the shepherds where to find the baby. And there is also the star that guided the wise men to the same location. And speaking of the wise men, there are three pictured: Melchior bringing gold, Caspar bringing frankincense, and Balthazar bringing myrrh. And not to be forgotten, the wise men usually have a camel with them. So a wonderful action set when you have the complete version. And so kind of just identified there. If we also see, I mentioned how in a lot of cases the tradition, of course, beyond the people you'd expect, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, the characters of the angel, so let's say the donkey that they ride in on to arrive is in the Lucan story. The idea that there's a manger, so therefore a cow, that's the Lucan story. The angel that comes to the shepherd, and the shepherd bringing the sheep, that all in orange there, that's from the Lucan Christmas story. Whereas the star, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, the three wise men and their camel, that's the Matthean story. So we can kind of see the merging here then of those two stories in one play set. Doesn't have to be play, it's a decorative set. And so these come in all kinds of varieties, and you can almost always find all of the figures. This one is missing the camel, so the wise men got there, they left their camel someplace. You don't want to miss the camel. Camels are so much fun for your play set. Got to see one of these for the first time in Palestine. And it's interesting that a lot of them were just actually kind of parked at the gas station. So people had ridden, Bedouins or somebody had ridden camels to the gas station, gone into the convenience store and things like that. And the camels were outside like cars. Anyway, there are other versions of these, more modern artistic ones, and again, they'll find all of the different characters from both of the two stories merged together to form a nativity scene. And of course, these can be actual play sets for kids, where this is a Fisher-Price version, which has, again, all of the different components. For some reason, in this case, even though the sheep is made it here, and the angel that talked to the shepherd, we're missing shepherds. And the three wise men have brought an entire wagon full of presents. So I guess little kids like presents, and so maybe that's why they have that instead of the shepherds, who are maybe less fun. And even a minimalist nativity scene, has the same kind of figures, although in this case it's missing shepherd, cow, star, and camel. So another frequent element that I didn't mention here is this background set, which you can see is sort of a little building. It's meant to look like a barn, a stable, and that sort of a thing. So let's take a quick nativity quiz for all of you guys in the chats and the comments. So nativity scenes depicting the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem are common at Christmas time. So where was Jesus born? And so the answer is A, an inn, B, Joseph's house, C, a stable, D, a cave. And so if you said an inn, you were tricked, because in Luke's gospel it says there's no room in the inn. So they're not actually at the inn, although some people associate the stable attached to the inn. So maybe that was a trick answer. So if you said stable, that's coming from the Lucan story. So they shepherds came with haste, we read, and they found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. So the baby is in a food trough for animals. It doesn't actually say that food trough is in a stable. That's an inference that people make because there's no room in the inn, and they lay the baby in a food trough. And so stable is what people infer from that. Same thing, we don't actually have they're riding, or they come to Bethlehem in Luke's story. There's no explicit mention of the donkey. Same thing, there's no explicit mention of the cow, although it's in the song, right? The cattle are lowing, the poor baby wakes, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the most common answer, I would think, that people said. But if you said Joseph's house, then you are probably a Matthewan Christian, a Matthean Christian. It says Matthew's gospel says that they essentially had always lived there. Joseph and Mary are from Bethlehem, essentially. It doesn't say that explicitly, but there's no sense that they've come from anywhere else in Matthew's story. And when the wise men show up and enter into the house, it says, they saw the young child with his mother Mary. And so in Matthew's story, they are from Bethlehem, they live in the house, they live in a house there at the beginning of the story. So I appreciate that I understand that Christian apologetics have created a harmony which implies that these are not contradictory stories and that they go together, and that, let's say, over the course of a couple years of hanging out in Bethlehem for the census, they buy a house and they start moving there. But the Gospels are not, they're independent texts, and they are not, and we're synthesizing that together. That's our own creation. That's not what the Matthewan Gospel is saying. Finally, if you said a cave, that's what they say if you actually go to Bethlehem. And so if you go to Bethlehem in Palestine, to the Church of the Nativity, underneath the church there is the grotto of the Nativity, and grotto is a cave. It was originally a cave that has now been further excavated over the course of many centuries, because it's the traditional birthplace. And so when I was there last month, as part of the delegation for Churches for Middle East Peace, because of the the real terrible circumstances right now of the war, no one was actually at any of these sites. And so we were actually given a tour of the whole church of the Nativity by the president of the Bethlehem Development Corporation that is in fact actually undergoing a multi-million-dollar restoration of this historic church, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so because we were really the only people there, they also, the three churches that have authority over the Church of the Nativity, the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Armenian Orthodox Church, gave us permission to film for my church's Sunday service, Beyond the Walls, from the grotto, which we'll have as part of our Christmas Eve service, if you care to tune in for that. So if we look at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem from the outside, it's kind of a vast complex of churches that have grown up around the original basilica. And from the outside, it really has the appearance of a castle, because a lot of it was built in the Middle Ages when there was a bunch of wars and crusades and that sort of thing going on, and after, where therefore it needed to be defensible. The main entrance to the Church of the Nativity has actually been bricked up and reduced twice. And so if you look at the thing here, the original colossal Roman era gateway would have been that big gate. Even the left side of this has now had a little wall built, or a buttress built in front of it, but it's been bricked in. And even the Crusader era Gothic archway, which was the original brick in to make a new portal, that is in turn also been bricked in. And so now there is a later medieval door where you have to actually duck down to enter to get into the basilica, which is actually pretty neat. Inside, there is a very classic Roman basilica. Constantine had constructed the original basilica here, which was dedicated in the year 339, and it would have had a floor plan that was very similar to the other great Constantinian basilicas, like Old St. Peter's in Rome, St. John Lateran, St. Paul Beyond the Walls, and so on. Justinian, that basilica got destroyed, and the Emperor Justinian rebuilt one in the 6th century, and this is primarily what we're seeing is Justinian's, although the Constantinian floor and all the mosaics on the floor are still there underneath this floor. During the Crusader period, this 6th century basilica was decorated in beautiful mosaics, which were later covered over and are now being uncovered and restored as part of that restoration process. So this is a floor plan of the Church of the Nativity. You can kind of see the original basilica here on the main floor that has now been surrounded by a whole complex of other churches that actually goes on a much wider campus of buildings that are all attached to each other. But the original basilica is here. There's the main floor, and you come towards the altar, and then beneath the altar there's two staircases that take you down into the grotto. You can see at the far left, that's that gate that I showed you that's been successively bricked up. So underneath the main floor, there is this underground grotto or cave that includes the traditional site where Mary lays the babe in the manger. And there's also the place, which is, I guess, presumably, I think the birthplace, but it's the place where immediately the star was supposedly directly overhead, according to, again, tradition here. So if you look at Orthodox paintings, so for example, there are beautiful murals of the iconography, Orthodox iconography at the church, the Eastern Orthodox Church that is just a few blocks from here in Toronto Centre Place, and it just has beautiful frescoes that were painted by monks that came over from Mount Athos for several years to paint them. And so one of them is a painting of a nativity scene, and this of course includes a cave. And so you can see Mary and the baby Jesus in the cave, and there's the donkey and the cow that are going into the manger, trying to, they always have kind of their heads there in the iconography. The shepherds are outside with the angels, and instead of the way we kind of see in the modern Western way, where there's the baby Jesus and both Mary and Joseph are on either side kneeling toward the baby, Joseph is actually outside the cave, looking a little glum in all of these icons. The star, of course, is above. And this pretty much fits into all the sort of Eastern iconography. These two are flipped, but essentially the same components are present, where you have Mary and the baby in the manger, and with the donkey and the cow, angels and so on the outside, and Joseph off in the corner outside the cave. So, default, like I say, the source elements for our story, we have our default characters, we have Lucan characters, donkey, cow, angel, shepherd, sheep, stable, and the Matthean characters, the star, the three wise men, the camel, the house. Of course, like I say, the donkey, cow, sheep, camel, and the stable are not explicitly mentioned, but they're inferred from the story. And the wise men, there's not actually numbered in Matthew's gospel. We don't have anything that says there were 3 wise men that showed up. Instead, it's wise men. They show up with 3 gifts, so that's why there's a traditional number of wise men. And then later tradition gives them these names: Melchior, Casper, and Balthasar. So, the cave may have been a tradition associated with the site in Bethlehem from the earliest times. We don't know when that site was maybe first identified. There are many caves in the area. Bethlehem is on a hill. There is a hill right next to it, which is where the tradition is, where the shepherds were. And so on that hill, there's another cave, which is a traditional site called the Grotto of the Shepherds. Regardless of how far that goes back, we can't tell, but our first written source for the idea that Jesus was born in a cave comes from the Gospel of James, which is one of the many Gospels that was left out of the New Testament canon. It's also called Infancy James because it's talking about, not about the adult ministry of Jesus, but the Nativity story. And it's also called the Protoevangelium of James. And who doesn't love a word like Protoevangelium? So Protoevangelium is the title that was given to the work by a very early publisher, Guillaume Postal in Switzerland, in Basel, who published the first widespread edition of the work in 1552. Postal presumed, based on what the Gospel itself says, that it was written before the other canonical Gospels. So it was written before Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, which is what the word means that he gave it, though, in Greek then. So proto, meaning first, evangelium, meaning gospel. So the gospel itself claims to be an eyewitness source, and it claims to be written by a certain James, someone named James, and we can, again, presume or infer from it that the James that is meant is James, Jesus' brother. Like the account in Luke, and not like the account in Matthew, in this Protoevangelium, in this Gospel of James, Joseph and Mary have to travel to Bethlehem, and they do so in response to a decree from Augustus. So we read in the Gospel of James, and he, Joseph, saddled the ass, and he set her, Mary, upon it, and his son led it, and Joseph followed. And so this actually has a mention of the donkey, which doesn't actually get mentioned explicitly in, I think, in Luke's story. And though, interestingly, Joseph here has a son. And so the story all through this Gospel of James assumes that Joseph already has, or it says that Joseph already has sons and children, and that these then are Jesus' siblings that are described in the Synoptic Gospels in Mark and Luke and Matthew, when it says Jesus has adult siblings. But in this case, it doesn't say where they came from. So it doesn't say whether they are Mary's sons and daughters or Joseph's or where they came from. But the story here in James very explicitly states that these siblings of Jesus are actually step brothers and sisters, and they are all older children of Joseph that Joseph had with his deceased first wife before he ever got to meet Mary. So we also have in the Protoevangelion the first mention of the cave. So they don't have any, there's no mention of an inn and no room for them in an inn in the Gospel of James. Instead, Mary senses when it's time that she's going to give birth while they're still on the road on the donkey. And so we read, they came into the middle of the road, and Mary said to Joseph, "Take me down from off the ass, for that which is in me presses to come forth." And Joseph took her down from the ass and said to her, "Whither shall I lead you, and cover your disgrace?" You know, this giving birth is a disgrace, according to what Joseph is saying. This Gospel, James, places special emphasis on this idea that Mary's pregnancy here is shameful and a disgrace. So he says, "For this place is desert, and Joseph found a cave there, and he led her into it, and leaving his 2 sons beside her, he went out to seek a midwife in the district of Bethlehem." So the Gospel of James now is very much a source for the idea of Mary being perpetually a virgin. So following the Septuagint version of Isaiah 7:14 reads, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive." And this is taken by nearly all early Christians to be a messianic prophecy in Isaiah. So a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you'll call his name, so Emmanuel, God with us, is kind of a prophecy. But even though in the Greek version, which is what early Christians were reading, it says a word that means virgin, parthenos in Greek, the original underlying Hebrew could mean virgin, but actually also mostly just means young woman. And originally this passage in Isaiah would have been referring to one of the wives of one of the kings of Judah. But now it is being reinterpreted as a messianic prophecy. And so both Matthew and Luke, the authors of those 2 Gospels, even though they are not working from each other's texts, do understand that Mary is a virgin, and they write that into their own nativity stories, that Mary is a virgin at the time that Jesus is conceived. However, the idea that Mary continues to be a virgin after Jesus' birth and then remains so for the whole rest of her life, that is not mentioned at all in Matthew or Luke, and indeed it first appears in the Protoevangelium of James. In James, as Mary is reposing in this cave that they found, Joseph goes back to the road and he happens upon a Hebrew midwife. And I'll just say that this portion of the text has shifted now to a first-person narrative of Joseph, even though the overall author claims to be James. And so we read, "And I, Joseph, saw a woman coming down from the hill country, and she said to me, 'O man, whither are you going?' And I said, Joseph, I said, 'I'm seeking a Hebrew midwife.' And she answered and said to me, 'Are you of Israel?' And I said to her, 'Yes.' And she said, 'And who is bringing forth in the cave?'" So she can obviously see the cave. The cave has got to be open, in other words, for her to be able to observe that. "And I said, 'A woman betrothed to me,' so my fiancé. And she said, 'Is she not your wife?' And I said to her, 'It's Mary, who was reared in the temple of the Lord. And I obtained her by lot as my wife, and yet she is not my wife, but has conceived of the Holy Spirit.'" And so this is actually backstory. So by the time we're getting to this part of the Gospel of James, we've already had a whole long birth and infancy and childhood and now young womanhood of Mary, Mary's story as she is reared in the temple according to the Protoevangelium of James, and how she came to be betrothed to Joseph by lot. And we'll go back to that and we'll look at that. But in any event, what's interesting here is that Joseph is pointing this out because he presumes that this midwife has heard this story. Mary, according to the Protoevangelium of James, is somebody who's famous across all of Judea. The midwife says, "Is it true that she's conceived by the Holy Spirit?" And Joseph said to her, "Come and see." And the midwife went back with him. And so now the shift here is back to third person. So now we're talking about Joseph instead of I and come with me or something like that. Now, it's back to third person. So anyway, they stood in the place of the cave, and behold, a luminous cloud overshadowed the cave. And the midwife said, "My soul has been magnified this day because my eyes have seen strange things, because salvation has been brought forth to Israel." And immediately the cloud disappeared out of the cave, and a great light shone in the cave so that the eyes could not bear it. And in a little that light gradually decreased until the infant appeared and went and took the breast from his mother Mary. And the midwife cried out and said, "This is a great day to me, because I have seen this strange sight." And the midwife went forth out of the cave, and Salome met her. And she, the midwife, said to Salome, "Salome, Salome, I have a strange sight to relate to you. A virgin has brought forth a thing which her nature admits not of." So I've seen this miraculous thing happen, but what the most important things is someone who is a virgin has given birth without having ever had sex with anybody. So as Salome is told this crazy thing, her response is very similar to the Apostle Thomas, who is told that Jesus has been resurrected in the Gospel of John, and he doubts that it's true, and he won't believe it, he says, until he actually puts his fingers into Jesus' side and feels that the wounds and can tell that this is the Jesus come again. So Salome said, "As the Lord my God lives, unless I thrust in my finger and search the parts, I will not believe that a virgin has brought forth." So that's a little excessive, gynecological detail for scriptures, but anyway, that's what it is. And the midwife went in, and she said to Mary, "Show yourself, for no small controversy has arisen about you." So you can imagine there's a little bit of an Christian apologetic response to, was Mary really a virgin, that kind of thing. And so this is the response. And so Salome put her in her finger and cried out and said, "Woe is me for mine iniquity and mine unbelief, because I have tempted the living God, and behold, my hand is drooping off as burned with fire." So by testing God, by performing this test, she's now been burned in that way. So anyway, if we look now at that, again, kind of traditional nativity, it's not only in Orthodox iconography, these go all the way back, and so this is a medieval Western mosaic, actually. Once again, Mary in the cave, the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes in the manger, with the donkey and the cow showing also in the feeding trough there to show it's a feeding trough. Once again, Joseph on the outside of the cave. Shepherds outside as well, along with the star and the angels. And once again, we have Joseph here with his kind of, "Oh my dear, what's going on?" Very doubtful and glum looking. And again, Joseph is also depicted as an old man, whereas in a lot of modern iconography, I'd say depicts Joseph as more age appropriate for Mary. Like, we know that she is a young woman, but maybe Joseph is also not that old, in his 20s or something like that. And they're a loving couple, as it's maybe now portrayed, as opposed to kind of an old guy who's sitting outside the cave when all of this is happening. Luke and Matthew do not mention Joseph's relative age. So Mary is described as a young woman. However, when we get in all of the Gospels, Mark, the first one, but then Matthew, Luke, and John, when we get to Jesus' adult ministry, Joseph completely disappears from the narrative. And so we presume that he's died and is not around anymore, because in fact, people actually refer to Jesus as the son of Mary. So Mary is a character who is present in all four Gospels that made it into the New Testament in Jesus' adulthood, and Joseph isn't there. By contrast, though, to just that inference that maybe, okay, he died and maybe that's why, maybe he was older, doesn't mean that he was. There's a lot of different reasons a person could die fairly young in antiquity. James, the Protoevangelium's version, explicitly gives Joseph's age, or the fact that he's really aged anyway, when the priests tell him he's to take custody of Mary. And so the priests say, you've been the one that's been chosen. Lot has fallen upon you to take custody of this virgin. And Joseph, it says, refuse. I have children. I am an old man. She is a young girl. I'm afraid lest I become a laughingstock to the sons of Israel. So the gospel here indicates that they are very, very different in age, so different that it would be embarrassing for people to imagine that this really old man is marrying this teenage girl. All right, so as we're looking at this traditional depiction of Mary in the cave and Joseph on the outs, as we say, we always see the cow and the donkey also at the manger. Joseph outside with shepherds, sheep, and an oh dear look, but sometimes Joseph is actually outside with other people. This same imagery is, like I say, not only in the Eastern iconography of the Greek Orthodox Church, it's also here in medieval Coptic icon from the Egyptian church on the left. In the West, there's a medieval Carolingian miniature, and then a 11th century Latin miniature on ivory. And you can kind of see again, Mary is always lying in repose. You can see the baby with the two animal heads and Joseph outside. Here's another example of it from a Western Latin illuminated manuscript. So this is the way the nativity scene was largely depicted in antiquity and in the Middle Ages. Sometimes when Joseph is out there, he's not just with a shepherd, he's conversing with an old man. And so this is also a detail that is from the Protoevangelium. So throughout the Protoevangelium, the Gospel of James, Joseph is beset by these doubts. And this is represented in iconography as Satan appearing to him in the form of an old man who's telling him to doubt. As a, completely not I don't think this is a tradition that survived anywhere, but I found it to be a very interesting little episode in the Protoevangelium. Joseph observes time stopping, which may be at the moment that Jesus is being born or right before it. And so this is again part of when he's in Joseph's first person. And I, Joseph, was walking and was not walking. And I looked up into the sky, and I saw the sky astonished. And I looked up to the pole of the heavens, and I saw it standing, and the birds of the air keeping still. I looked down upon the earth, and I saw a trough lying, and work people reclining, and their hands were in the trough. And those that were eating did not eat, and those that were rising up did not carry it up, and those that were conveying anything to their mouths did not convey it. But I saw the faces of all were looking upward, and I saw the sheep walking, and the sheep stood still. And I saw the shepherd raised his hand to strike them, and his hand remained up. And I looked upon the current of the river, and I saw the mouths of the kids resting on the water and not drinking. And all things in a moment were driven from their course. And so at this dispensational moment of Christ, God being born among us, there is something that would be, like I say, a pretty common CGI superhero special effect where all of time stops. And it's described in a very interesting way here in this ancient text, which I think is, I haven't seen in other ancient texts, this idea of a time stop. So, like I say then, the Protoevangelium, this book of James, is the source of many key traditions. The idea that the Nativity took place in a cave, the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity, the idea that Joseph was an old man with doubts about the pregnancy, the idea that Jesus' siblings are Joseph's children by a prior marriage, and even details like the names of Mary's parents, St. Joachim and St. Anna. There are plenty of churches of St. Anne that are named for Mary's parents. The name of Mary's parents comes from the gospel here of James, the Protoevangelium. And actually, a lot of times we've talked a lot about the fact that the historical Jesus actually had historical siblings like James, and many times when people are in the audience that are listening to the lectures, they insist, well, that's because these guys are Joseph's children by a prior marriage. They're really stepbrothers. They're not actual brothers. But again, there's no other earlier source for this. That's not what the canonical Gospels say. That's coming from tradition, which is coming from this text. So, as mentioned, this Gospel claims to be written by a certain James. And so what's the source of it? So as the Gospel itself concludes in its ending, it says, "And I, James, that wrote this history in Jerusalem, a commotion having arisen when Herod died, withdrew myself to the wilderness until the commotion in Jerusalem ceased, glorifying the Lord who had given me the gift and wisdom to write this history. And grace shall be with them that fear our Lord Jesus Christ, to whom glory be to ages of ages. Amen." So, this time period is happening at the death of Herod, so very, very early on. That same trouble in Jerusalem at Herod's death maybe is referenced in Matthew, where we read that after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life," that is to say Herod the Great, "is dead." So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother Mary and went to the land of Israel. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in the place of his father, so Herod Archelaus is now ethnarch over Judea, Joseph was afraid to go to Judea, and so having been warned in a dream, Joseph withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So this is Matthew's apologetic account of how Jesus, who was always known traditionally as Jesus of Nazareth, that's multiply attested. Nazareth is Jesus' hometown, but the messianic prediction was that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, and so this is Matthew's way of getting a Jesus who he feels should have been born in Bethlehem to his actual hometown of Nazareth. But again, because the idea here is that there is an unsettling thing that happens in Judea after Herod the Great's death, the claim is that the Gospel of James is written in that time period soon after the death of Herod the Great, so way earlier than 70 years earlier than Mark. So this dating, if true, would make the text the earliest Gospel by far. The text, like I say, does not specify which James is supposed to be its author, but throughout the text there are many references to Joseph's sons, and so that makes it plain that the author is meant to be one of those sons, which is to say Jesus' brother James, also called James the Just. So James is a historic figure. We've had a whole lecture on James, the brother of Jesus, and also on his church and also his rivalry with Paul, and also why Paul's church is one. So there's plenty of lectures on these topics that we've already explored. James is attested by Paul, who is his rival, and also by Josephus, who mentions him as having been assassinated by local Jewish leaders during a later time of unrest in the 60s. And what we understand from both of those sources is that, and also Acts, is that James, the brother of Jesus, led the Jerusalem church after Jesus' death and until his own death. So Herod the Great died in 4 before the Common Era, the year 4 BC. And that's the reason why, for example, that Jesus' birth is usually given as 4 BC and not 1 AD. The Anno Domini system was only really worked out and popularized many, many hundreds of years after Jesus' birth. That was not the way years were numbered at this time. People were not counting down backwards, getting to BC and waiting for the year 1. And so it's not entirely, there's no particular reason why 1 is the actual year of the birth. It was a later calculation that somebody made. And because people would prefer to imagine that the historical Jesus was born at the time of Herod, because of the Matthean story, didn't have to be. Matthew could have created that story. There's no reason to imagine that story has historicity. In any event, that's why it's normally listed as 4 BC, because that is when Herod died. If James was already an adult by the time Herod died, then he would be 50 or more by the time Jesus is crucified, and then James would be in his 80s when he himself was martyred around the year 62, which is a time we can calculate based on Josephus' account of when James, the brother of Jesus, was killed. Nevertheless, if he was at the early part of his life writing a whole gospel, the Protoevangelium, it's a bit strange that then for the whole rest of his life, as he becomes even the leader of a Christian movement, the main Christian movement after Jesus' death for decades, that he never added to his text if he were truly the author. It's only something that he worked out when he was a young man and never returned to. The fact that that's not the only problem with the idea that this is written so early or written by James at all. So, for example, James was a Jewish Christian. Initially he's Jewish, and then later, when Christianity emerges, he is a leader of a Christian community in Jerusalem. He was very familiar with Judaism. He also lived in Jerusalem, and so, at least in the end of his life, and actually according to this, he lived there very early too. So I guess most of his life, probably we could assume. And thus, James would understand, for example, how the Jerusalem temple worked. He would understand the way the temple complex operated and so on. The Protoevangelium's author describes Mary being raised in the temple as a virgin girl, and really that's not something that happened in the Jerusalem temple. It is something that happened in paganism. So, for example, the Vestal Virgins in Rome are pagan priestesses of the goddess Vesta, and that may have been an idea for this source, but it's this idea that this is the actual history of Jesus' mother is certainly not attested anywhere else, and did not happen. As we've seen, the Protoevangelium shares material with the Lucan narrative story, but it also has kind of direct overlaps that show literary dependencies, and there's several quotations, at least 5. And so, for example, part of the Gospel of James we read, "And behold, a voice was saying, 'Hail, you who has received grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women.' And Mary, looked around on her right hand and left to see whence the voice had come. So she has this voice that makes that declaration in the infancy gospel. And of course, both of those things, hail, the Lord is with you, blessed are you among women, those are probably very familiar to people who know the Lucan story and some of the prayers that have been drawn from those. And so we read in Luke chapter 1 that an angel appeared to Mary and said, greetings or hail, you who are highly favored, the Lord is with you. And then later when Mary is visiting her cousin Elizabeth in the Lucan story, Elizabeth exclaims, blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you bear. So again, it's putting it into the angel's mouth, but it's the same phrases. So this is a literary overlap. And there are other places too. In James, we say, we read, and seeing Mary, Elizabeth blessed her and said, whence is this to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For behold, that which is in me leaped and blessed you. And that corresponds, when I'm using this, unfortunately, we don't have a modern public source, and that's why I'm quoting this with the whence and that kind of thing, but it's, there's an English version of it. So we have that same corresponding story in Luke, where in a loud voice, Elizabeth exclaimed, why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. So in both cases, we have the idea that she is recognizing Mary as the mother of Christ, mother of my Lord, and also that the baby that she's pregnant with, the future John the Baptist, also has leapt for joy at this event. And so those are direct overlap between James and Luke. And there's other ones too. So we read in James, there was an order from the Emperor Augustus that all in Bethlehem of Judea should be enrolled. And that is very similar to the beginning of the second chapter of Luke, which reads, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. So there's definitely dependence, right? So either if infancy James is what it claims to be, the very earliest gospel ever written, then the author of Luke has a copy of it and is using it very sparingly because there's only a couple things that have been pulled and most of it has been not used. Or the author of infancy James is writing much later and themselves has a copy of Luke. So like I say, it could theoretically be either one, except for when we also consider that infancy James has literary dependence with Matthew as well, so not just with Luke. And so, for example, and when you look at the two texts, infancy James versus Matthew, after Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant, in infancy James, we read, and night came upon him, upon Joseph, and behold, an angel of the Lord appears to him in a dream, saying, be not afraid for this maiden, for that which is in her is of the Holy Spirit, and she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, and he will save his people from their sins. And that corresponds very closely to the same point in the story in the Gospel of Matthew. An angel of the Lord appeared to him, to Joseph, in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. So again, an overlap here of dependency. The author of Matthew either has a copy of this text or the author of the Protoevangelium has a copy of Matthew. The Protoevangelium includes additional episodes from Matthew's nativity story, including the visit of the Magi, who come with their gifts. Turns out that they show up in the cave right after Salome and the midwife are there. The Protoevangelium of James also includes the story of the massacre of the innocents, the story of Herod putting to death all of the children from age 2 and younger. That occurs only otherwise occurs in the Gospel of Matthew and not in Luke. But kind of strangely, the Protoevangelion connects that story to Herod searching for the infant John the Baptist, who is not mentioned in Matthew. Rather, that's a detail in John the Baptist being a cousin and being born around the same time. That's a detail from the Lucan story. So we read again in the Protoevangelion, when Herod knew that he'd been mocked by the Magi, in a rage he sent murderers, saying to them, "Slay the children from 2 years old and under." And Mary, having heard that the children were being killed, was afraid, and she took the infant and swaddled him and put him into an ox stall. And Elizabeth, having heard that they were searching for John, took him up and went into the hill country and kept looking to where to conceal him. And as Herod searched for John, he sent officers to Zacharias, who was Elizabeth's husband, John the Baptist's father, and says, "Where have you hid your son?" And so this contradicts what Matthew's gospel said, because in Matthew's gospel, Joseph again is warned in a dream that Herod is going to do this, and he and Mary and the baby have already fled to Egypt by this point. And indeed, it's actually presumably happening a long time later than the birth, whereas in this case, it's shortened and it's happening immediately sort of after the birth. And Mary is still wrapping Jesus up in swaddling clothes as an infant, and she hasn't left for Egypt, and she instead is hiding him in an ox stall. So it's an interesting different variation on it, but otherwise the same details that are found in Matthew, with also characters like Zacharias, Elizabeth, and John the Baptist that are from the Lucan story. So because Matthean and Lucan material for the Nativity stories does not overlap, there are a couple points of minor agreement, which are that Mary is a virgin and that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but those are such widespread messianic prophecies that any gospel writer would be likely to include those details. So they're working independently, Matthew and Luke. And so because there's no overlap between their material, but there's lots of overlap of Matthewan and Lucan material in Infancy James, it clearly shows that Infancy James is making use of both, and it follows both. So it isn't what it's claiming to be. It's not an early gospel. It's not the earliest gospel. It's actually a later gospel. So interestingly, though, even though it is a later gospel, it's not so late that the author considers Matthew and Luke to be so completely authoritative that he's not contradicting them. So we saw that he isn't using the same details of the story that we find in Matthew. He's eliminated a bunch of the Luke stuff. There's no shepherds and so on. So the author of James is still telling his own story. He's not making what we call a harmony of the Gospels, where you combine the Matthew and Lucan stories the way we do in our nativity sets, like I showed you, where you have all of these Matthew details and all these Luke details, and they're all characters, and they're all together at the same stable in the same place set. And so most of the material actually for Matthew and Luke stories are surprisingly not included, even though each of them only have a couple chapters on this. So the author of James is willing to contradict Matthew and Luke's Gospels as he tells his own story, but nevertheless, he is using them as sources. So therefore, Infancy James, or we'll now start calling Pseudo-James, was written after Matthew and Luke, and so they're from the 80s and 90s, and so therefore it's written after that. And if it's not James who wrote it, who did? Well, the text was certainly known to Origen in the early 3rd century, who talks about it, and it's possible that Clement of Alexandria is making references to it or allusions from some of the details of it, and he's writing in the late 2nd century. And many scholars think then it was in circulation by the middle of the 2nd century, by the 150s, so it's written sometime around that. Like all pseudepigraphic texts, when you're pretending to be somebody who you're not, you haven't said who the real author is because you've made a false, a false name of who's writing it. Therefore, when we don't know who the actual author is, and we have to, find hints at who they might be by looking at the contents. And so we always have that, both for anonymous texts, like the canonical Gospels, but also for pseudepigraphic texts. So, two of the key themes in this Pseudo-James are really his obsession with the virginity of Mary, which goes on a lot, and also his general disapproval of sex as shameful. And so we'll look at that. That may be providing us with one of our core clues. Infancy James begins with a story of Mary's future parents. Like I say, they're named Joachim and Anna, and this is where we get those names. Following on all of the models from the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, there are all of these couples who have gone to old age and who haven't been able to have children. And so that includes Abram and Sarai, so Abraham and Sarah in Genesis, who are looking forward to eventually the birth of their son Isaac, but also, for example, the mother of Samson, the super powerful judge, Hannah. She has also having trouble having children, and so makes a promise to God that if she is able to conceive, she'll dedicate her child to the Lord. And so Samson has to take very special vows and is raised as a Nazirite so that he doesn't cut his hair until he's tricked into having his hair cut. Likewise, from the New Testament, there's the example of John the Baptist, whose mother Elizabeth and her husband Zacharias were also not able to have children until, again, very late in life. This is the author of Luke, again modeling a story on the birth of Samson and Samuel. So just like all of these examples then, Anna, the future mother of Mary, has been unable to have children. She's been mocked, and so she prays by all the people who, again, women's value in the society is by being a mother. And so Anna prays for a miracle. And look, an angel of the Lord stood nearby. We read in the Protoevangelium, saying to her, Anna, Anna, the Lord has heard your prayer. You'll conceive and give birth, and your offspring will be spoken of through the whole world. And Anna said, as the Lord God lives, whether I give birth to a boy or a girl, I'll bring it as a gift to the Lord my God, and it will minister to him all the days of his life. So just as Samuel, who is given as an oblate and he becomes a great prophet, he's given to the priest Eli to be raised in the shrine at Shiloh. And just as Samson takes those vows, so too Anna's child is going to be dedicated to the Lord. When the child is 3 years old, Joachim, Mary's father, said, invite the daughters of the Hebrews that are undefiled, and let them each take a lamp and let them stand with the lamps burning, that the child may not turn back, and let her heart be captivated from the temple of the Lord. And they did so until they went up into the temple of the Lord. So there's this idea that eventually they're going to give her to the temple. They don't want to. But again, all of this idea that you have to have this, they're having this kind of ritual and that is involving undefiled, that is to say virgin daughters of the Hebrews with lamps and things like this. This doesn't seem very Jewish in its traditions, and it seems again more common with pagan traditions like the Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins keep a sacred hearth fire burning at the temple of Vesta in Rome. So this is one of the instances where, again, the author doesn't seem to be as focused on actual Jewish traditions. On receiving Mary finally into the temple, the high priest has a prophecy and he predicts "The Lord has magnified your name, Mary, in all generations." And he also predicts that Israel's redemption would come about through her. And so this makes Mary famous throughout all Israel as this little pure girl that is now going to be raised in the temple. And according to the text, Mary then grows up in the temple of the Lord, and she's nurtured like a dove and receives food from the hand of an angel. And there are depictions of Mary growing up in the temple, again over in the Orthodox Church, and the iconography being fed essentially communion wafers as her food from angels. With so many fabulous predictions made about her, Mary is famous, but then as she's getting older, everybody starts to get worried. When she became 12 years old, there was a council of the priests saying, "Look, Mary has been in the temple of the Lord 12 years. What should we do about her so that she won't pollute the sanctuary of the Lord our God?" So there's the idea that a menstruating girl living in the temple would cause a ritual defilement and pollute the sanctuary. And they said to the chief priests, "You stand at the altar of the Lord, go in and pray about her, and if the Lord reveals anything to you, we'll do it." So, unable to keep her in the temple, but wanting to preserve Mary's virginity, which is incredibly valued in this text, the priests assemble Israel's oldest widowers, and they essentially have a contest or a lot to see which of them should be given custody for her protection. They figure all these old guys are less likely to, want to marry her and have sex. And so as the sign, a dove flies over Joseph's head, and he reluctantly actually has to be charged with being destroyed, as he really does not want to take charge of the virgin. He doesn't want to have Mary brought into his custody. And this idea that there's a sign again of the dove that flies across him, this is thinking of that's how Romans in fact do all of their divination, is by bird flight and things. It's not that there aren't signs in Judaism too, but again, this is kind of, it's not specific to the Old Testament kind of reading, for example. Joseph takes Mary into his household very reluctantly, but he has to go off on carpentry projects, and when he finally gets back, he realizes, we read, "Mary was in her 6th month of her pregnancy, and behold, Joseph came back from his building project, and entering into his house, he discovered that she was big with child, and he smote his face, and he threw himself on the ground upon sackcloth, and he wept bitterly. With what face shall I look upon the Lord my God? And what prayer shall I make about this maiden? Because I received her a virgin out of the temple of the Lord, and I have not watched over her. And who is it that has hunted me down? Who has done this evil thing in my house and defiled a virgin?" So Joseph accuses Mary of having had sex with somebody. Joseph says to her, "Oh, you who's been cared for by God, why have you done this and forgotten about the Lord your God? Why have you brought low your own soul, you that was brought up in the Holy of Holies, and that received food from the hand of an angel?" And Mary wept bitterly, saying, "I'm innocent. I have known no man." And Joseph said to her, "Whence then is that which is in your womb?" And she said, "As the Lord my God lives, I do not know whence it is in me." So Joseph continues to have all kinds of doubts, and that he's eventually assuaged by an angel in that phrase that we read earlier. But when the priests learn the news of Mary's pregnancy, there's another whole round and even more rage about the defilement. The priest said, "Mary, why have you done this? Why have you brought your soul low and forgotten the Lord your God? You that wast reared in the Holy of Holies, you that received food from the hand of an angel and heard the hymns and danced before him. Why have you done this?" So having sex is just terrible. And she wept bitterly and said, "As the Lord my God lives, I am pure before him. I have not known a man." And the priest said to Joseph, why have you done this? So the general equation of sex with defilement and this obsession with virginity continues, pretty much throughout the whole text. And so that's caused some scholars to theorize that maybe the author was part of a non-Orthodox, non-Catholic, so non-mainline 2nd century Christian sect known as the Encratites. And so founded by an early Christian named Tatian, the Encratites are, whose name means the people who exercise the self-controlled ones. They abstain from meat and wine and sex. They absolutely forbid marriage, and so they are opposed to, any of these things. They're an ascetic group. The mainline Christians, the emerging Proto-Orthodox Church, people like Irenaeus of Lyon, one of our earliest main writers at the end of the 2nd century, who wrote his big book against what he called heretics. He definitely labeled this group as one of the heretical groups. And several other early Proto-Orthodox Church fathers also talk about them, saying that they were widespread across the East. Origen says, he has the detail that they didn't consider Paul's letters or the book of Acts to be scripture. A lot of times when you have a religion or a sect of a religion that is opposed to sex and marriage, they also kind of die out by natural causes. That happens. But in this case, they actually died out by being killed. So the Emperor Theodosius, after he has made Christianity, and specifically the main line of Christianity, Nicene Christianity, the state religion of the Roman Empire, he kind of brutally suppresses a lot of any divergent Christians, any groups that are considered heretical groups. And so he makes an edict in 382 that the Encratites are also, it's a capital offense. And so they eventually are totally suppressed. So we don't know that it was coming out of this, but in any event, it is from an author who has, sex on the mind and thinks of sex as being really bad. There's a lot of that in early Christianity, but there's even a special obsession in this text. So whether or not the gospel came from an early Christian group that was later condemned as heretical, and that's one of the things that often kept gospels out of the canon, that may be one of the things that kept it out of the canon. Also, perhaps people did not believe the attribution that James, the brother of Jesus, had written it. And so therefore it was not understood to be a valid text and when the New Testament was being put together. Even so, its contents were not kept out of Christian tradition. As we've seen, lots of the details, lots of ways people think about, especially Mary and her family, Mary, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, Mary's perpetual virginity, the Catholic doctrine of those things, are drawn actually from this source first and foremost. And again, the ongoing idea of Orthodox iconography also draws really directly on its contents. And indeed, there's other influences. So Mary, as understood in Islam, is also in the Quran said to have been fed by angels, a text detail coming from infancy James. And so Pseudo-James, while not actually written by James, not actually called the Protoevangelion, but not actually the first gospel, not actually in the canon, but nevertheless having a substantial legacy. And so hopefully that's been a fun way to get us ready for the Christmas tradition and our Christmas break. And I'll get a glass of water, and Leandro is going to find your comments for me. And so I want to thank, first of all, people who have been donating during the lecture. Thanks to JM, to Jeff Kuntz, to Lawrence Martin, to Darth Arama, to Bo the Wolf, to Fire Ever Living, To Dave Anderson and Mark Long, really appreciate all of your support. Fire Ever Living is Daryl. Ted Gemberling asks, why was the Constantinian Basilica destroyed? I have to look back and see what that was. I was wondering if it was, if there might have actually been a natural cause, or whether, it was I'm not thinking that there's a lot of earthquakes there, so maybe a fire, but I don't think that, I don't know the answer to that, Ted, but anyway, I don't, so it was earlier. It's not like it was destroyed. I don't think who would be attacking that. Maybe the Persians came in and attacked it, but actually the Persians, I'm not sure that they did, so I'd have to look it up. Gustavo Lopez Aguado says, who is with Joseph in those Greek murals from the Nativity? Maybe he said it and I was distracted. So Joseph is out there. There's a couple occasions when he's out there with the shepherds, but most often in the iconography, he's with an old man in kind of like a fur coat. And this is Satan dressed, iconographically, symbolically, it's Satan dressed as an old man, and Satan is sowing doubts with Joseph. Ron Wagner says, so when was the Gospel of James originally written? So it's not from the time it says, which would be whatever, around the year 1 or 2, but in fact it's more like 150 probably is when it's written, so the middle of the 2nd century. Myzology Media says, what are the chances that James, the brother of Jesus, wrote this? Nil. It's not written by James, the brother of Jesus. So it doesn't have an understanding of Judaism. It's anachronistic. It's literally dependent on books, Matthew and Luke, that are written after James, the brother of Jesus' death. It's ignorant about how the Jerusalem temple works and so on. So I would just give it a 0% chance that James, the brother of Jesus, wrote it. Donna Ford said, how did Mary come to be raised in the temple? So it is at the beginning of this story, and it is like one of those oblation stories that is modeled on especially the Samuel story. So the same way that Samuel's mother gave Samuel as a little boy to Eli, who then raised him in the shrine at Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle was kept, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, according to the book of Kings, or actually the book of Samuel. And so that same kind of model is shown here, where again, this God-given child who is announced by the angels that she's going to be famous and have this incredible role, that she is also donated to the Lord, and so she's brought to the temple, and the high priest who is in charge of the temple immediately also, has a kind of a visionary or prophetic experience about her, and so that's why she's kept to be raised in the temple, and even as the text says, in the Holy of Holies, sometimes, I guess, when the angels are giving her wafers to eat, that's certainly never happened. Only the high priest could go in there. Certainly women couldn't go anywhere near that part of the temple. There's a court where the women aren't, the women only men could go beyond that. And it's only the high priest could go there once a year, and then, again, then only once a year. So it is not aware of how the Jerusalem temple actually worked, but it is a story that is created by the author here of her living in the temple, that's based on the Samuel story from the book of Samuel in the Old Testament. Ron Wagner, is there any overlap between the Gospel of James and the Q source? So no, by the time the author of James is writing, the Q source, if it's still in circulation, there's no indication that the author of James would have that. The author of James here is not interested in the sayings of Jesus. Jesus is appearing as a baby in the story and doesn't give any sayings. And so there's also no sayings attributed to John the Baptist, which would also be in the Q source. So none of the things that would be part of the Q source are in the Gospel of James, so there'd be no overlap. And even so, we know that the author of James had copies of Matthew and Luke, both of which are dependent on the Q source. And so if there was any Q material in James, which I don't think there is, we would know that they got it from either Matthew or Luke. Andrew, you want to pull up the questions? We're at Wayne's World of Science and Technology. Wayne's World of Science and Technology said, do we have any indication of which community Pseudo-James is from? So a lot of scholars have suggested it's a second century community, Christian community in Syria, maybe. And again, some people have suggested that maybe it's a kind of an Eastern community that is viewed by the mainline church as heretical because of an excessive focus on the idea that sex is bad. And so that's possibly it, but we don't have anything more than what inferences can be drawn based on the themes that the author is interested in. Hislang says, John, have you heard much about the new movie Mary that was released on Netflix earlier this year? I saw some people on Twitter upset about it because it was allegedly based on the Protoevangelium. I have not seen it, and I didn't know that. If I had known that, I should have watched that before this lecture. So sorry that I didn't hear that. I'll have to look at it and see that. It would be very interesting. It's always interesting to find that. I haven't seen the whole thing, but there's a from the what's his name's who's the guy from Braveheart, the actor? Mel Gibson. So Mel Gibson's Jesus movie, there's this very crazy thing happens where Jesus is talking to, like, having visions, and he's talking to the devil, and it's going back and forth. I'm like, what on earth is this? Well, and I did not understand where that came from, because that's not in the Gospels at all. The Passion of the Christ, yeah, and the tradition that comes out of it, that's coming from like some kind of a 19th century Catholic woman's vision, which that of something that Jesus, a dialogue that Jesus and Satan have during the passion part of the Christ. And so in the clips I saw of that, I was like, where is this coming from? And so it is weird sometimes when there are non-biblical sources that provide a lot of these kind of details. And so I could imagine if they made a Mary movie, you would have to use, if you're not going to just make everything up yourself, you're going to have to use the Protoevangelium as your main source, because this is the main source by far for all of the sort of Marian tradition. So it's the author here who made up all of those Mary things originally, as opposed to, like I said, unless you're going to make up your own Marian ideas now. Kimberly McLean says, does all this mean that people were just coming up with assumptions, surmising things about Mary? And so I just said that, and so yes, but actually what I would say is, where are they getting it? So there's two major sources for when they're creating narrative backstory. So in antiquity, we don't have biographies that are the way modern biographies work. Modern biographies, we understand we have a modern idea of self and psychology. And so when we're talking about how you developed as a person, you talk about things that happened in your life that had an impact. You met a particular teacher. You had this sort of event. These kinds of things shaped who you are. In antiquity, biography is 100% different from that. Instead, you always are this being who was always destined for who you're going to be. And ancient authors only write stories about childhoods in order to foreshadow all of the things of who they're going to be. And so all ancient biography is what you're saying, just people making assumptions and making up stories in order to prefigure who the person was already going to be. And that's going to be true for everybody's ancient biography, Caesar or anybody else. And so where are they getting those details? The sources are not necessarily just coming up with the top of their head about where these ideas would come from. They're getting things from the Septuagint, from the Bible. And so they're taking a model story, like I mentioned, that story of Samuel's mother, and they are taking that as a source and saying everything that happened before prefigures all the things that's going to happen now. We don't know the details of how Mary was raised, but she must have been raised in this same sort of style that would be consistent with the Old Testament, and so they get that as a source. And then the other part of it is that they have theological ideas that are important, and in this particular case, this author is very interested theologically in the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity, and so they're telling a story in order to demonstrate a theological belief that they have, or a theological position they have. And so in that sense, it's not fiction in the way we think of a fiction where you're just making up a story for its own end, for entertainment's sake, but actually, in this case, to resonate with Old Testament scripture and to teach a theological position or a theological proposition. Fire Ever Living says, do the names and other details of the Magi come from this or from somewhere else? The Magi names do not come from this. We have had a lesson on the Magi, and I'm not immediately remembering where those three names come from, which source that is. Balthazar, his name, there's actually it's a reuse of a name for Daniel given in one of the Greek additions to the book of Daniel in the Septuagint. So part of the apocryphal stories of Daniel calls him Balthazar. And so I would think that that's where that name initially comes from, and then it's just reused for one of the wise men later. But yeah, I'd have to look again at what the source is for those three traditional names. Myzology Media says, I was also wondering if the Magi are at all mentioned in the Protoevangelium. Yes, they are mentioned. So they show up, like I say, right after Salome is doubting that Mary is a virgin and does her test in the cave. Salome and the midwife were there, and then the Magi show up shortly after that with the gifts at the cave. Or do we have any other extra biblical sources mentioning them? No. And so in fact, this also doesn't count as an extra source because James is dependent on Matthew. So what's the source about the wise men in James? Matthew. So there is no other source at all. There is no independent source of the Magi outside of Matthew. There is no other source that Herod massacred all of the children in Bethlehem or in Judea or wherever, whatever limited space it was, outside of the Gospel of Matthew, even though that seems like that would be such a monumental event that it would be remembered as Herod is already considered a villain, certainly by Josephus. Josephus loved to tell stories of Herod killing his own sons and things like that. And so if that had happened, it would have made its way into Josephus, it would have made its way into any other source. So the Magi and the Herod story, the massacre story, occur in Matthew alone, and they're unattested anywhere else. And so scholars universally, I think, consider those to be non-historical. So those are stories that Matthew has, again, a theological purpose for. So the massacre of the innocents is that thing I talked about, the typology, where Matthew is trying to show that Jesus is a new Moses. And so Moses is, according to the book of Exodus, there's a massacre that happens or is supposed to happen where all of the baby boys are supposed to be killed. And again, there are Hebrew midwives that are supposed to do that but don't. And that idea of really good Hebrew midwives in Exodus is probably the source of the Hebrew midwife that the Protoevangelium of James is talking about. It's referencing again the Hebrew midwives that are in Exodus. So that's where Matthew is probably getting that massacre story. Again, the Exodus story is also non-historical. That also didn't happen, but it's a typology. So there is to show that Jesus is like Moses. The story of this happening for the birth of Moses is repeated by Matthew to talk about the birth of Jesus. And same thing then the Magi, that's not like that. That instead is part of Matthew's indication that Jesus is born a Messiah, not just for the Jewish people, but for all the world. And so who recognizes it? But the main important foreigners in the Middle East, the Persians, the Magi are the astrologers, the priests of the Zoroastrian religion. They recognize that Jesus is a Messiah and come there according to Matthew, who's created this tradition. That's not part of Zoroastrian tradition. So K. Tempest Bradford says, it's fascinating to me that so many traditions have come from non-canonical sources. They're good enough for tradition, but somehow not good enough for the Bible. Any thoughts on that? Well, so there were some standards about what could make it into the Bible and not. That said, people were desperate for these. People want to tell, like if you're going to make a Mary movie or something like that, you want to have these kind of details. And so, like I said, unless you're going to supply them all yourself every single time, if you want to make pictures of this stuff, you have to have. Are they born in? Is Jesus born in a house? Is he born in a stable? Is he born in a cave? You're going to want to show those kind of things, and if the story doesn't exist in the Bible, but you have all of these details from somewhere else, it's hard to suppress the details. It's much easier for Theodosius to write a list of Christian or groups that he considers now heretics, and maybe suppress them, and maybe burn their books. But it's harder to get rid of details that are in the tradition once they're there, because you can't replace something with nothing. Miguel Angel says, does the first person part of the story imply that the current version is a combination of smaller texts? So it is possible that there's something going on. The Marian story is, there's a bunch of different weird chapters of this. But the one problem with that, I guess, is that the whole thing is so short. And so it could be that there was something like that was a smaller part. I'm not sure. Like you say, there is a weird shift there, and so it could mean that there's some kind of a seam that we're seeing. But it's such a small text, it's hard to dissect it and find like this was like an original part and then this has been added to it or something like that. Julie Bezuski says, when did the nativity scene tradition begin? So there are Christmas plays that go all the way back into the Middle Ages, actually. And so one of the things that revived the idea of theater, eventually comedy and drama, is actually Christian plays. Initially, nuns in monasteries were writing some of these, but then later they become popular plays that people put on related to the different Christian festivals, and so that revived them. So for that kind of a festival, and then in terms of having an actual live nativity scene where you get the cows and the donkey and you set the whole thing up. Famously, Francis of Assisi did that, and so he's good at doing stuff that people like and remember, and that was something that people really liked. And so he was one of the, if he didn't make it up, he's one of the early popularizers for it. And finally, Fastball Flake says, when is the next Let There Be Answers episode? And so I have to ask Leandro that. Do you have any idea? I mean, it'll be in January. Yeah, so we'll tell you after Christmas, but it'll probably be in January. So we're trying to get back on our schedule where we do most every Tuesday, but if sometimes we won't be able to have a whole new lecture, we'll probably do a Let There Be Answers. And so guys, we're going to wish you a Merry Christmas and also a Happy Holidays to everybody, whatever religion you're at. Oh yeah, and we'd love to have you join us for a Christmas Eve service, which is primarily going to be music. So Landro is going to host. He's going to talk about all of the different music that the Beyond the Walls choir has, Christmas music the Beyond the Walls choir has recorded. Mike has recorded a bunch of special Christmas music. It'll just be a lot of fun Christmas Eve evening. So please join us for that.